I think that that education is the key in all this. I think that for kids to know about steroids and to know that they exist and that people are going to take them, it's just the honest brutality of life. You know, it's just a true thing that happens. So to say that it doesn't happen and people don't use these drugs and not talk about it and sweep it under the rug is just the total wrong way to get kids to not use steroids. The best way, I think, is to educate them on, you know, and I think my brother says it. He says, you know, look, steroids are not for kids. They're for grown adults to think about. It's a, you know, something to think about. I know a lot of people would differ with that, you know, statement because, you know, definitely the way that he's doing it is illegal. However, on the other hand, my brother could easily go to a doctor and get prescribed testosterone, you know, and have the same results basically. They're not going to prescribe him as much as he uses, but definitely, you know, enough to give him a boost in what he does. So, you know, it's something that, in my mind, it's like I'm always on the fence about it. I'm always thinking both ways. But as far as kids go, you know, I would hope that kids would understand that they need to train themselves, you know, as hard as they can for as long as they can, and hopefully they're not even thinking about steroids until later on in life. However, I get emails every day on Facebook from 16-year-old kids asking me if they should take steroids. And I tell them no, and then they say, well, what supplement should I take? So, I mean, their mind is already in the performance-enhancing game, you know, before we even start. It's like kids want to know if creatine is good, and this is good, and that's good. Is it? We don't know. I mean, no one's really out there testing and studying it for kids.
Professional sport, as we've seen over the years, and close observers will have an even finer perception of this, showed a tendency to drift a bit from meaningful sport competition into a mere form of entertainment, in which perhaps it doesn't matter anymore whether the competition is real, so long as the mobs in the Coliseum are amused and diverted. I've got to say that nowhere is that more evident than the acknowledgement by the World Wrestling Federation, WWF, that its name should be changed to WWE, World Wrestling Entertainment. It doesn't even purport to be sport anymore. But again, governments cannot be blind, unless they're willfully blind, to the undeniable fact of widespread drug use among professional players. In the United States, just to revert to the WWE for a moment, the number of steroid-related deaths among its participants is staggering. It's completely off the charts for men in that age category. Nor can they be blind to the example that professional athletes set for young athletes who idolize them, who aspire to their level of performance, and who observe and emulate their conduct. If it takes drugs to get to the top, and their heroes do it, then that is the message that is impressed upon them. And if the sport authorities do nothing about it, and the government does nothing about it, the message of tolerance of drug use is further reinforced.
Many of these drugs are not detectable under current testing methods. The blood transfusions that Howard just mentioned, tremendous problem in cycling and other endurance sports where it gives a huge advantage. So yeah, it is sport dependent. There are sports that I think, at least in disciplines in those sports, and when you're talking about cycling, you're looking at stage races where athletes compete for 3 weeks at a time in some of these races. That's you're going to have a very high percentage of athletes in those sports, and you can tell that using drugs, and you can tell that by the number of positives we've had in those sports. Another drug that's frequently used, insulin, very dangerous drug, not detectable, and so you know we need to keep testing. Because despite what's been set up here, very dangerous drugs that can cause instant death are being used by children and athletes that go up into their 20s and 30s. But Bernard Cole came to this country a couple of weeks ago and told an audience of scientists that almost every day in the Tour de France he used insulin. That can cause instant death. These are dangerous drugs, and they have to be as much as possible driven out of sport.
Public. In the public files where there were names of athletes who were identified as having been consumers of the products, having been working with Victor Conti, all of the names of the athletes were redacted. They were blacked out. Or they were referenced generically as a Major League Baseball player or an Olympic athlete, for example. There was no mention. The names were essentially excised from the public documents. And when agencies such as the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency went to try and gain access to that material because they knew the Olympics were looming and they knew and believed that there were names of athletes that were in those documents that they needed to prosecute or go after to keep them from competing in the games, the U.S. Attorney's Office said, look, we're not giving you this information. We can't help you. And so ultimately, the only reason the Anti-Doping Agency got that material because it turned to Congress, and Congress then subpoenaed the documents and made them available to the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency to begin to make cases. It began, or when it emerged publicly, was the government ultimately indicted these four men that nobody had ever heard of: Victor Conti, Greg Anderson, Barry Bonds' personal trainer, and two other men, a track coach and an assistant at Balco. And when the government released the documents in the Balco investigation and made them public at the time of the indictments, they made an interesting choice in revealing this information to the public. In the public files where there were names of athletes who were identified as having been consumers of the products, having been working with Victor Conti, all of the names of the athletes were redacted. They were blacked out. Or they were referenced generically as a Major League Baseball player or an Olympic athlete, for example. There was no mention. The names were essentially excised from the public documents. And when agencies such as the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency went to try and gain access to that material because they knew the Olympics were looming and they knew and believed that there were names of athletes that were in those documents that they needed to prosecute or go after to keep them from competing in the games, the U.S. Attorney's Office said, look, we're not giving you this information. We can't help you. And so ultimately, the only reason the Anti-Doping Agency got that material because it turned to Congress, and Congress then subpoenaed the documents and made them available to the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency to begin to make cases.